as we go into 2025, I continue to be obsessed with playing my Novation circuit live set and tinkering with it, adding new stuff, swapping stuff out, and generally keeping it new and fresh as much as possible. That leads me to an interesting question. What if I want to drop something live that the circuits just really weren't set up to do? That often takes the form of playing stuff featuring sounds that the circuits just can't make. So then, okay, I've got to load in a bunch of samples to make those sounds, but I've got an hour and 15-minute long live set. I'm running out of sample time and out of sample slots. So I want to show you a couple of pretty over-the-top tracks and then one much more restrained one, and using those, show you how I've been harnessing the circuit's strengths to make them do stuff they weren't necessarily designed to do. All right, let's start off with this 4 on the floor electro-ish beat because I think it pretty well demonstrates the technique I'm going to be using here. This is a remix I did for a friend. It's not out yet, but I wanted to drop this segment in particular. And so I've basically got to get the circuits to do bass house. And that's not sound design that the Trax is really capable of at all. And as I mentioned before, I was already running out of space on the rhythm. So I had to get pretty creative with how I approached this. So here's the bass track. So first, let me show you what the original bass sound sounds like. That's basically the minimum viable number of sounds I need in order to create that drop pattern. So now I can chop that up and basically reclaim all of those individual one-shots. They've just been consolidated into one sound, so I can save sample slots because I'm slammed for sample slots. So these I didn't end up using because it's only like 5 or so sounds. Something like that. Let me play that by itself. So this technique to take the minimum viable sound and then chop it up worked really well here. And I have cut the lows, distorted it a bit. I'm also reverb and very slapback delayifying it. Gives you some width, but you gotta use that in moderation. And even then, you'll notice that chop sounds a little bit sloppy. Like it seems like stuff kind of starts and stops at slightly different spots. And that's a little bit odd and a little bit frustrating, but once you sidechain it to the kick, you don't notice. And I made the very deliberate decision to have a separated sub bass. That way I could balance everything as strategically and surgically as I wanted to. Separately, on the circuit tracks, I've loaded in this little screech sample. So this was already sidechained to the kick in my DAW project. And I've got a lower octave one and a higher octave one that I can switch between to give my drop some variation. So that's layered in with my big, disgusting bass house bass. It's a subtle element, but without it, I think the drop sounds a lot more empty. I think that adds kind of a lot, actually, and was worth the time it took to load sounds independently into both devices. Then I can keep building, so I've got a clap, hi-hat, and that's about it. This whole sample chopping technique means that I can also do stuff like this build, because I needed to do a pretty abrupt transition. So in the previous project, I've got my bass chop, and I'm filtering it in very slowly. And I've basically constructed a build out of whole cloth. Raising the tune, and then that takes us into the full drop pretty nicely. And you can kind of brute force transition like between any genre by doing filter shenanigans like that. And if that last one seemed like it was a bit much, this one's completely deranged. So let me show you how I transition from this to, you'll see. So, I'm not an asshole. I wouldn't play this at a rave type gig. I wouldn't do that to people. But in a situation where I'm playing alongside bands or solo artists, I think this is completely acceptable, especially for one guy that I work with often who is very encouraging of artists that play with him to just try stuff. And so I'm like, damn it, I'm just going to drop something unhinged. And it went off appropriately hype. So that vocal is ripped from an Angel Maker song, and once I heard that song, I realized that I had to flip it into dubstep. Like, that wasn't an option. It was just something I was contractually obligated by my brain chemicals to do. So we've got kick, snare, cymbal. So this is a very similar technique to the previous drop. All of that is crammed onto one sound. Then I can use the sample chop feature to jump between them. Something like that. And then I've got this extra growl for the end for that little turnaround. And I'm basically just recombining all these short little segments in as many ways as I possibly can to get as much variation as possible in order to create that giant drop. Filter it. I think you get the idea. And then once again, I've got a separated sub. And in this case, I'm actually automating the slope so that for that first note, it rings out. And then I've brought the slope down, so I've got those short, stabby little bass notes. And that's done via step automation, where you hold down a step and then twiddle a knob. So the slope here is turned up, so the bass note rings out. And then here the slope is turned down, so the bass note is shorter and stabbier. Sidechained it. And then I've got a very subtle little screech layer for this as well. And it didn't sound very good, so I buried it in the mix. It's also worth noting, by the way, that Angel Maker vocal sample is on the circuit tracks. And I've distorted it quite a bit. And I mentioned this in a previous video when dealing with vocals on the circuit tracks. I've adjusted the start time of that vocal just a little bit so that when it's piped into the circuit rhythm, it comes in at the correct time and compensates for the latency that you get when connecting these two devices via audio. Also, real quick, I just completely revamped my $5 sample pack. It's available down below, and it takes a bunch of additions that I've made to the sound pack over the years and consolidates them, makes them a lot more organized, and adds even more new stuff. If you already bought the sample pack, you already have access to this update, and if you haven't yet, you can check down below in the merch shelf or the description, and also maybe browse shirts like these. Regardless, thank you so much for watching, and let's get back into the video. And finally, let's look at something a little more laid back. So, as you may have guessed, the sound that these devices can't generate is this, which is a loop I made in my DAW. I talked about how I made it in a different video, so I'll spare you the details here, but the point is, I loaded that whole loop into here, but check this out. If I just drop the sample in, as is, on top of a kick drum, listen to how it sounds. I feel like, especially on that first playthrough, it kind of slid out of sync a little bit. And this is an ongoing problem I've had, where if I have a rhythmic element that's a little loop, say, on the circuit rhythm, just playing it as is doesn't quite sound right to me. So, what is a guy to do? I need this to be in sync, and I really want to drop this track because I really like this little percussion element and the groove it creates. So, to solve this problem, let's bring back the thing that I've just been talking about at length, sample slicing. So if I go into slice and make sure this is set to 16 slices, hey, there are 16 one-shots contained within that sample. So automatically, it gave me 16 clean one-shots to work with. Yes, I could have loaded every single one of those one-shots into individual sample slots on the circuit rhythm, but given that I have an hour-plus long live set with a ton of material, that would be wildly inefficient. So instead, I can just lay these all out on different steps. And now, it won't slide out of sync with the kick. That's way cleaner. And I can kind of disguise the edges of those chops a bit with some reverb and delay. And then, of course, I've got my ear candy samples. And then I have these two sounds bouncing off each other. And all of this is very deliberate. Like, this is not the kind of thing you create on a whim. I'm sure that's pretty obvious at this point. This whole thing is very much a result of my dogged determination to do a live set exactly the way I want to do it on a Novation circuit setup, because I really like performing with them and I really want to drop certain specific things. So these are my workarounds to make these be able to play the songs I want them to be able to play. And if you'd like to see even more techniques to squeeze the most out of the Novation circuits, you can check this out down over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.